Hi, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of the Central Nervous System lecture. Previously, we took a look at some of the main structures of the brain, including cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, and your brain stem. We also take a look at white matter versus gray matter, and the fluid that flows around and inside your central nervous system, which is the cerebrospinal fluid, how it is made, what are the structures that you can actually find this fluid, etc. We also start to take a look at the cerebrum in a little bit more detail, where we discuss the words such as gyri, sulci, fissures, and again, the gray and white matter of the cerebrum. So we're going to take a look at the functions of the cerebral cortex or cerebrum in a little more detail. So again, just a reminder that whenever I use the word cerebral cortex, we are specifically talking about the gray matter that is found at the most superficial level of your brain. It is about only 2 to 4 millimeter of your brain on the, again, more superficial aspect of the cerebrum. If you guys recall, what we identify as gray matter would be non-myelinated axon, as well as the cell bodies of the neurons. Because they lack that insulation, their color appear as darker or grayish. An interesting fact, about 40% of your brain mass is concentrated within your cerebral cortex. So you can understand the importance of cerebral cortex in accomplishing what your brain actually does as a whole. Now, a very brief overview of what your cerebral cortex actually accomplishes includes awareness of your environment, collecting sensory data, and making sense of what you're actually sensing. So basically processing the data. And then lastly, creating voluntary motor control, which basically means it is associated with your skeletal muscle. So let's take a closer look at some of the general consideration we can have for cerebral cortex. First, when we look at cerebral cortex, and you can see the color coding as we go through the PowerPoint, we can break down the cerebral cortex to 3 main functional areas. Again, when you hear the word function, we're talking about what that part of the brain can accomplish in terms of tasks. So they are part of, your cerebral cortex collects sensory data. So basically, conscious awareness of your sensation. Those sensations include your sense of vision, your sense of hearing, your taste or gustatory, your sense of a smell or olfactory, your sense of touch, which is known as somatosensory, your sense of balance, which is called vestibular, and senses that are associated with your internal environment, such as stretching, stomach ache, etc., known as visceral senses, as an internal senses. Motor area is another part. So motor areas are basically parts of your brain that are responsible for controlling a skeletal muscle movement. And again, remember, these are voluntary movements associated only with a skeletal and not a smooth muscle or cardiac muscle. And lastly, a large portion of your brain is dedicated to what we call association area. Association area is where you integrate diverse information to basically process what's happening around you from various senses. And then basically it makes you have the capacity to memorize information, recall information, troubleshoot, problem solve, multitask, etc. And again, it may not click right now, but as we go through this, hopefully the color coding of the cerebral cortex, as well as reviewing these 3 main functions, will help you guys understand the general function of the cerebral cortex in more detail. Now, each hemisphere has, if you're looking at the cerebral cortex, each hemisphere has a basically concept of contralateral, which means the left side of your body is being processed and controlled by the opposite side. In this case, if it's left, the right side of the brain is processing it, and vice versa. This is the whole concept of contralateral comes into effect when somebody has a stroke, and if the stroke is affecting the right side of the body, the right side of the brain, then you can see the symptoms of muscle paralysis on the left side of the body. The concept of lateralization or specialization. Please don't mistake that with contralateral. So lateralization implies that each half of the brain is carrying a specific function in certain region. And I'll talk about that in terms of Broca's area or Wernicke's area, which are associated with your ability to make sense of a speech or written words and ability to make sounds or speech. And then another function or consideration when we talk about cerebral cortex is that conscious behavior that involves the entire cortex in one way or another is also done by cerebral cortex. So basically, I think about it, how you act in your environment, how you act with your friends and your family in a classroom, whatever the setting is, those behaviors significantly controlled by your cerebral cortex with the input from your sensations. Now, to kind of highlight this whole understanding of the brain, I like to show you these 4 pictures. I want you to understand that when we're talking about, let's say, your sense of vision is associated with the occipital lobe, which is the back of the brain. That does not imply that when you are looking at something, that is the only part of your brain is active. What it actually means is that when you are looking at something, you may see the higher activity levels in the occipital lobe, but the other parts of the brain is also engaged during that process. So look at the color coding you see in these images. So anytime you see green, that basically means less activity. And as the color starts to go toward the yellow and then the orange and then eventually red, that means that's where you have the highest activity. So if you notice on the first picture, you have seeing, which implies that, again, brain activity throughout the brain, but you will have more activity in the occipital lobe. And you're thinking about hearing. Hearing is more focused on the temporal lobe, as you'll see. When you're creating a speech, it's associated with your frontal lobe and an area called Broca's area. And the really fascinating thing is when you are thinking, your whole brain almost is engaged in the process. That is why it's so important to keep your mind active, because you kind of get these really highly active areas throughout your brain rather than localized activity in one part and another. Now, this picture is going to be your guide for quite a few slides that are going to come up. By the end of this PowerPoint, you will be able to do the labeling, all of the labelings that are described here. And this is the expectation I have of you. So by looking at this picture, you should be able to say, okay, this part has this function, or this part has another function. Now, in terms of color coding, let me kind of help you understand this in a little bit better. Anything you see in blue color or purplish color or dark blue or light blue color, which is focused on the temporal lobe, your parietal lobe and occipital lobe, as well as your insula, which is not depicted here. Those would be associated with your senses, either figuring out what or basically ability to sense something, whatever that sense is, vision, auditory, gustatory, olfactory, and then making sense of that data, which is also known as association cortex. What you see in red, different shades of red, that's associated with skeletal muscle movement. Now we'll go into more detail why it is broken down to multiple pieces as we go through the PowerPoint. And lastly, what you see as pink color, these are identified as multimodal association areas, and there are technically 3 parts that are described here. And again, I'll go into more details about them. Couple of points that you guys want to notice also is the presence of central sulcus, which is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Also notice the area that is in front of the central sulcus, that's your precentral gyrus, and the darker blue color right after the central gyrus, central sulcus would be your post-central gyrus. So let's go ahead and take a look at these in a little bit more detail. So we're going to get started by looking at our sensory area. Now again, remember, sensory is 2 aspects. First, being able to receive the sensory data and then processing what that sensory data actually means, which is typically associated or recalled or called as association cortex. So it is, when we're talking about your sensory area, it is related to your parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and insula. And we're gonna look at this in detail in pictures. Now, there are 8 main areas within your cerebrum or your cerebral cortex that are associated with the sensory areas. They are known as primary somatosensory cortex, which is basically the area you receive your information from your sense of touch. So somatosensory, your sense of touch. You have an area called somatosensory association area or some association cortex. That is the area that basically help you understand what you're touching. So if I'm touching a surface that is rough versus a smooth versus hot or cold, does it have vibrations? Is it, I don't know, hard versus soft? All of these associations are done by somatosensory association cortex. You also have what we identified as visual area. Now, as we go through this, we notice that visual area also has its own breakdown, which is what we identify as primary visual cortex, and then primary visual association or visual association area, which basically means, okay, I can see, and then what I see, I can distinguish as a specific object or person or car or color, etc. Auditory area is the same concept. So basically, again, you have primary auditory cortex and then auditory association area. I can hear, that's your sensory data. I can tell you what I hear is sound of music versus somebody is talking to me versus, let's say, somebody playing an instrument, right? Or I'm listening to an instrument. Vestibular cortex, this is associated with your sense of balance. We have olfactory cortex, which is your sense of smell. Gustatory cortex, which is your sense of taste, and then visceral sensory area, which, as I mentioned previously, is associated with your sense of internal senses, also what you feel actually internally. So let's go ahead and dive into these 8 sections or 8 sections associated with your sensory area. So as I mentioned earlier, the first one would be primary somatosensory cortex. So this is specifically associated with your post-central gyrus. Again, to kind of help you recall, your post-central gyrus would be the area immediately after your central sulcus. and it is the area that receives general sensory information from basically your skin, your skeletal muscle, your joints, your tendons. So it's collecting data from your environment, more specifically from your external environment. It is helping you to also distinguish between a spatial discrimination, what we identify as body regions, or what body regions being stimulated through sense of touch, vibration, pressure, temperature, etc. Now, one other thing that I do want you to understand when we're talking about primary somatosensory cortex is within this postcentral gyrus, you have data being received from specific parts of the body, okay? Now, we already know that that data is contralateral, which means if let's say my fingertips on the right hand, it's sensing something, the data is being processed on the left side of my brain or left postcentral gyrus. That whole concept of contralateral. The other thing that you notice is that there are areas that have higher number of neurons that are dedicated for collecting data. And the more neurons that collect data, you need to dedicate a larger portion of your postcentral gyrus to processing that information. So let's take a look at a picture. Now, for this picture, we're looking at this, which is our sensory postcentral gyrus, as you can see in blue. So notice that even though your foot is relatively small, a large portion of the postcentral gyrus is processing that data. Why? Because your foot has a lot of sensory neurons that collect data, which is kind of logical because foot is a part of your body that comes in direct contact with external environment, and it's a very easy way for you to identify any dangers in your environment. So if you're walking on something hot or sharp, your foot would be the first part that comes into contact and can make you aware of your environment. Look at your hands, guys. Again, hands in relation to the size of your body are relatively small. However, there are quite a few amount of sensory neurons that collecting data from your fingers and your fingertips, which again makes sense. You want your fingertips to be sensitive to your environment because the more sensitive they are, the better they can collect data and therefore basically make you aware of your environment. Same concept applies to your face, which include your nose, your lips, your eyes. A lot of data wants to come from those regions of your body. And we also have the tongue. Tongue is really small, but look at the size of the postcentral gyrus dedicated to it. And then lastly, genitalia. So again, genitalia is really important in terms of reproduction, kind of logical. You want to make sure you protect it to the best of your ability. So again, keep in mind when we're talking about parts of the body that are essential in terms of collecting sensory data, you're going to have a lot of neurons associated with that region, and consequently a larger part of your postcentral gyrus dedicated to processing that information. Now, kind of quickly look at this picture, guys. Look at your basically your trunk and your lower limb. Even though it is a large mass of your body, a small amount of sensory data is being collected, which means the neurons are kind of spread out throughout the body and do not collect as much sensory data. And the way I think about it is if you have ever seen these exercises where somebody draws something in your back and they tell you to figure out what that person is drawing. And a lot of time people get them wrong because their senses, their sensory receptors are so far apart that it's hard for them to distinguish the feeling of touch on their back, which I think is interesting. So here again is your postcentral gyrus in dark blue color, which is your primary somatosensory cortex. Now again, as we said, we also have an area called somatosensory association area. This part of the brain is dedicated to figuring out what the data that you're receiving actually means. So it helps you determine texture, it helps you determine the relationship of body parts to the objects that are being felt, it helps you determine size, temperature, the amount of pressure on your skin, etc. Again, the job of this part of your brain is integration of the somatosensory data to help you make sense of your environment. This information being collected by an area posterior to your primary somatosensory cortex, and that area is called somatosensory association cortex. So do keep in mind again, if I have an area, or sorry, I should say, if I have some sort of damage, whatever the reason is, either bleeding, trauma, force, that can cause damage to primary somatosensory cortex, I basically lose the ability to feel the sense of touch, depending on which area of the brain is being affected, or which part of the postcentral gyrus is being affected by it. Now, visual area. Again, visual area we described as two parts. The primary visual cortex, which is the most rostral area of the brain, so right here, and then we have the area right in front of it called visual association area. So apply the same concept I did for you here. Primary visual cortex is where your optic nerve that comes from your eyes actually sends the data to. Again, this is contralateral, which means the data from your right eye gets collected by the right optic nerve and gets sent down to the left occipital lobe, and vice versa. So primary visual cortex, all it does, it basically gives you the ability to see. Visual association area utilizes the previous memory and knowledge that you have to help you figure out what you actually see, interpret the signals or the visual signals that you are receiving. For instance, it helps you figure out the color, the form, the movement, ability to recognize faces, objects, etc. It is a very complex process. It is typically involved the entire posterior half of your cerebral hemisphere. So kind of remember, visual cortex, you're gonna use a big part of your brain, or big part of your posterior hemisphere or your occipital lobe. Now, pay attention to this, guys. Let's say you have some sort of problem, again, some sort of trauma, you may have a stroke, some sort of bleeding in the brain that affects specifically the primary visual cortex. So if the primary visual cortex is damaged, then the person is technically going to be functionally blind. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with their eyes. The eyes are collecting data, but by the time the data reaches its destination, which is the primary visual cortex, you're dumping that data to nowhere. Now, these people cannot see, so therefore they cannot distinguish the objects. Now, what if the damage is as a result of lesions or trauma to what we identify as visual association area? In such cases, the person can actually see, so they can see, for instance, there is a person in front of them, or there is an image in front of them, or there is an object in front of them, or a specific color in front of them. However, they cannot tell you what that information actually means. They cannot tell you that they're seeing, let's say, their mother, or they cannot say that this is a clock or the color is red, okay? So this is important for you guys to recognize the difference between primary visual cortex versus primary visual association area. I also want you guys to recall that when I said the visual association area, the information that helps you basically understand what you see comes from literally years and years of seeing the images around you and collecting data about those objects and persons. So let me give you an example. So I like this example, I always include it. So imagine somebody was completely blind. Okay, they were blind at birth, right? And there's a sense, this is a joke technically. And this person goes in and let's say goes to this place and prays, and he comes out running and laughing and super excited that now he can see, right? So this person comes to this previously blind guy, and he says, it holds a pen in front of him, and he says, tell me, what color is this? And the pen is blue, and the blind guy says, it is blue, I can see. Second guy gets really mad and hit him in the face. And he said, why are you hitting me? He says, how do you know this color is blue if you have been blind since the birth? The only reason you can tell me this is blue is if somebody has told you basically from childhood that this color is blue, this color is blue, this color is blue, right? And you've seen many shades of blue. That's the only reason you can recognize this color as blue. And if you don't have that built up of information in your brain, you will not be able to immediately identify colors. You can say there is a color, there is something, there is different shades of something, but you should not be able to identify it if you have been blind since birth. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is your auditory areas. So again, auditory areas implies that you're talking about your sense of hearing. Now, notice again, in sense of hearing, you have two areas or two sections within the auditory area. What we identify as your primary auditory cortex, so area that is collecting data from a nerve called, your cranial nerve number 8, called vestibulocochlear nerve. And that is the part of the brain, again, receiving that data from cranial nerve number 8. Auditory association area that sits right immediately in the back of that or posterior to that is the area that, again, can tell you based on your previous information that you've collected that the sound that you're hearing, right, is a sound of somebody talking to you, playing music, your phone ringing, etc. So you're using your stored memory to figure out what you're actually hearing. So again, the areas specifically would be within the temporal lobe, and the primary auditory cortex is anterior, and the auditory association area would be posterior to that. Olfactory cortex is also localized in your temporal lobe. It doesn't have that significant, I guess, breakdown as you would see in terms of your auditory or your visual or your somatosensory. You have an area within your temporal lobe that is associated with your sense of smell. It collects data from olfactory bulb and tract, which is basically located right superior to your nose within the ethmoid bone. And it is, again, involved in conscious awareness of odors that you're smelling. So again, distinguishing you're smelling a cookie versus a loaf of bread versus trash. Sorry, kind of going all over the place. We also have what we identified as vestibular cortex. Again, vestibular implies kind of your sense of balance, the positioning of the head in your environment. This is associated with your inner ear. The data is being collected from your inner ear, specifically a region of that called the vestibule, and the data being sent to your insula and being processed for, again, your sense of balance. Your other two senses that we haven't really discussed in detail is the sense of taste or gustatory sense or cortex, and then the visceral sensory area. Gustatory is also being processed by your insula, and again, it's associated with perception of taste. And visceral sensory area is your ability to sense changes within your internal structures, such as an upset stomach or a full bladder. So there is no specific region per se within the insula that we would like you guys to identify for gustatory versus visceral versus vestibular. However, you do need to know that all three are associated with insula. Okay, So I'm going to talk about motor area now. So motor area would be an area that is controlling the voluntary actions of a skeletal muscle. It is localized to the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe itself is broken down to a smaller parts or areas called one primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, a Broca's area, and the frontal eye field. So let's go over these, and then we'll continue with our next part afterward. So primary motor cortex is an area associated with your voluntary movement of the skeletal muscle. And the area that carry out these movements is your precentral gyrus. Again, recall your precentral gyrus is the area immediately in front of your central sulcus as part of the frontal lobe. So right here, this kind of ruby red color that you have, that's your primary motor cortex associated with your somatic motor, sorry, I should say it's primary or somatic motor cortex moving your skeletal muscle. Now, please do keep in mind that motor, like your sensory, or somatosensory specifically, has a homunculus, which basically implies the areas of your body that requires fine movement of a skeletal muscle will have quite a few neurons going to those muscles for fine motor skills. These muscles include the muscles in your face, giving you your facial expressions or micro expressions. It also goes to your fingertips for giving you the ability to move your fingers, for instance, play an instrument, a musical instrument, typing. All of these are associated with fine motor skills. Holding a pen, writing. The concept of contralateral still exists here. So if you have, again, damage to the right side of your primary motor cortex, the muscles on the left side of your body will be paralyzed. And you also have these things called pyramidal cells. These are kind of large clusters of neurons that are essential for ability to create conscious control and precise movement of your skeletal muscle. Again, here is a depiction. Your hands and your face, as well as your tongue, has a large area dedicated to it because you want to have those fine motor movement when it comes to your fingers and your facial expressions. Now, if you're looking at the brain more anterior to your precentral gyrus, you have an area called premotor cortex, which is this area right here. So premotor cortex is really important in giving you the ability to create repetitive motions. What better known in common terms as, I guess, muscle memory. So this is where you don't really think about completing an action or controlling your skeletal muscle. Your premotor cortex actually makes those decisions and pass that data to your precentral gyrus. So it helps you basically plan the movement without you actively thinking about it. So it controls, again, things that are learned, repetitive motions, and pattern motor skills. A few examples of that is when you drive your car, you don't really think about actively pushing a gas pedal versus brake, right? When you type, if you've been typing for a while, you don't actively think about it. When you are playing an instrument, you don't actively think about which chord you need to push if the motion is repetitive and you've been doing that for a while. The really common cool examples that you can see is people where, you've seen the YouTube videos when the person is not even looking, but, cutting something or packaging something, right? And you don't even see the motions of their hand. They don't even look at the process. These are motor skills, right? Accomplished by repetition, and all of them are controlled by the premotor cortex. Now, in terms of homeostatic imbalances of this region, if you do have damage to the primary motor cortex, which is your precentral gyrus, as a result of a stroke or bleeding, you can have paralyzing of your muscles in the opposite side of your body. Again, that's the whole concept of contralateral. You can have muscle movement is not necessarily impaired, so there's nothing wrong with your muscles. However, the connection between your nervous system and your skeletal muscle is disrupted. If you have damage to the premotor area, which controls the movement of, let's say, your fingers, then you can move your fingers, right? But the ability to effectively type, for instance, is gone. So you lost that, that talent that you have gained by repetitive motion. So what is the solution to somebody that have had damage to these areas? What they usually do is they undergo physical therapy. What is physical therapy? Is basically a repetitive motions of the same actions they have problems with. And that repetition allows them to create new neuron connections that replaces the one that have been damaged or destroyed as a result. So can somebody recover from a stroke? The answer is yes. The recovery might not be full, but you can gain the abilities that you have lost through repetitive motion and creating new neuron connection in your premotor area and in your primary motor cortex. Another area of the brain that you have is within the frontal lobe is the Broca's area. Broca's area is the area that basically controls your speech. This area is present both on your left hemisphere and right hemisphere with two different functions. So this is where the lateralization concept comes in. So in most people, so if you're right-handed, the primary or the Broca's area would be on the left. Again, the whole concept of contralateral. It helps you create a speech by helping and dictating the muscle movements that create a speech, basically. I do want to note a quick note here. So when we're talking about the Broca's area, if the left side of your brain in the Broca's region is responsible for creating of the speech, the right hemisphere on the same region, your Broca's area, will be responsible for the emotional overtone. So see, they're doing two different functions. So take the Broca's area in the frontal lobe. If it's on the left-hand side, it's responsible for speech. But if it's on the right-hand side, it helps you create the overtone of your speech. So as I'm talking to you guys, right, what I'm doing is I'm creating words, right? And I'm also have a tone to my voice. I'm either excited, sad, angry, happy, whatever that emotion is. That overtone is created by the Broca's area on the right side of the brain. Lastly, you have an area called frontal eye field. So frontal eye field, as the name implies, is going to help you control the eye movement. That's pretty much as simple as it gets. So I don't need you guys to know any more detail about that. So we're back to this picture, guys. So as of right now, based on the information I've described to you, you should know what is each of the red areas correspond to, what each of the blue colors represents. So the next part that we're gonna talk about in part 3 of the central nervous system would be what is the job accomplished by the multimodal association cortex, which are represented in pink.